Hey everybody, welcome. Matt Connarton Unleashed, the television edition, our first Unleashed television edition of 2016. So as we begin another year, it's an exciting year. It's an election year. Well, I guess every year is an election year to some extent, but this is a big one, you know, and I always, to me, election night, when it's a presidential election, it's like the Super Bowl, except it's only once every 4 years. Yeah, I'm not a sports guy. I couldn't care less about football, so my Super Bowl is election night. But, so we have a lot to get to, first, I do want to say thank you to everyone who supports the show, and I'm excited to be doing this for another year, in addition to, of course, the radio edition of Unleashed, which you can hear Monday through Friday at 11 p.m. Eastern on IPM Nation Live 1. Just go to IPMNation.com for that. One of our live channels, we do that weeknights at 11, and then every Tuesday and Thursday night, we're also on OTR FM, the premium channel on Ohm Times Radio. We continue to do that into 2016 as well. And we do archive all the podcasts on the website on IPMNation.com, the podcast versions of the show. So you can go back and listen to them on demand for those of you who are just too tuckered out at 11 o'clock at night to listen to me rant and rave. So that continues. That's exciting. There's going to be some other new things happening in 2016. A lot of new programming coming to IPM Nation, which we're very, very happy about as we continue to broaden our nation, our universe, whatever. So both radio and TV, particularly radio with the 2 live channels that we have. So that continues as well. So thank you to everyone. And also we are working on, I'm not sure if I mentioned it on this show or not, but we are getting everything archived on YouTube as far as the television edition. I have successfully recovered the original episodes of MCU TV when we were at QC News with Glenn R.J. Willett and, of course, my co-host at the time, Chris Rose. Those actually are, we did put them on YouTube, so if you look on the IPM Nation YouTube, you will see them. But some of them, in the titles, it just looks like a bunch of numbers. I have to go back and fix all the titles, figure out, you know, what the original air dates of those were. But because the original version of this show, for the first year that we did the show, we were at QC News. We weren't here at MPTS. But I did want to have a complete archive, and it's kind of fun to go back and just see some of the guests and hear us discussing politics 4 years ago when we were when I made my actually I remember I made a prediction, and I'd forgot about this, but I was playing some of the old videos. I had predicted that that Rick Perry would be the Republican nominee in 2012. When Rick Perry first got into the race, I predicted that he was going to be a very credible threat to Governor Mitt Romney in the South, because, you know, Romney might win New Hampshire, but then Rick Perry, you know, when you get to the next big one after New Hampshire, South Carolina, Rick Perry would win that. Super Tuesday, when you've got a bunch of Southern primaries and other primaries all on the same day, Rick Perry would sweep the South. Rick Perry was going to crush Romney for the nomination. That was my prediction at the time. And, of course, that was long before Rick Perry's campaign just completely flamed out and he had his oops moment, and boy, those were the days. Rick Perry had some great ads, though. I will forever reflect wistfully on the particular ad where, the campaign ad where it was just unintentionally hilarious. You know, there's Rick Perry. He comes walking out of the woods wearing his red flannel jacket. I guess it was a cold day in Texas, and he looks into the camera and says, "Can you believe we live in a country where homosexuals are allowed to serve openly in our military while our children can't even say Merry Christmas?" And I just was like, what? I thought like, is this a real ad or is this satire? This is just bizarre. So, and I was looking forward to more of Rick Perry in 2015 and 2016, but alas, he flamed out extra early. He couldn't even make it onto the main debate stage. But, you know, he is under federal indictment. So, hey, so could Hillary at some point. But I am sticking by my prediction. Obviously, some of my predictions are not correct. I am not the Nostradamus of politics, but I am sticking with my prediction that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee, and as a result of that, Hillary Clinton will be the next president of the United States. Also, I should mention later, if you're watching this live on Wednesday, later on today at 6 p.m., of course, I'm the co-host of with the Honorable Gary S. Hopper on Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades, and our guests are going to be, apparently we have a few guests, Bill O'Brien, who of course has been on many times, Senator Bob Smith, former Senator Bob Smith, he's been on once before, and I know Gary admires him a great deal, and Heidi Cruz, the wife of Ted Cruz, will be joining us. You know, it's kind of nice being in New Hampshire in terms of the political season, because we are the first in the nation primary. So it's so it should be a great show later. I will be as the only registered Democrat in the room. I will be outnumbered, but I'm used to that. It's kind of fun. And I don't really, I'm a registered Democrat because I might run for something, but I really consider myself an independent. In fact, Gary Johnson, apparently, who I voted for in 2012, I did vote for Obama in 2008. In 2012, I voted for, at that time, Libertarian nominee Gary Johnson, the former governor of New Mexico. He has just announced that he will, in fact, run again. This showed up via the AP this morning. It says former New Mexico Governor Gary Johnson is planning to join the crowded 2016 presidential race, according to Reason. Johnson's longtime communications aide, John Vaught Lebram, I don't know if I said that correctly, retweeted Reason's post. Quote, "Tune in tomorrow. I'll be on @Fox Business with @Team Cavuto and may have some news to share regarding the hashtag 2016 presidential elections, #Libertarian," Johnson tweeted Tuesday night. Cavuto's show airs at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Johnson, who is a self-made millionaire, also ran in 2012 as a member of the Libertarian Party, which advocates for a radically smaller and less powerful federal government. He received 1,275,971 votes, or 0.99% of the total electorate, which is far less than other independents have gotten in the past, unfortunately. But one of those votes was mine. In a 2014 interview with Newsmax, Johnson said, quote, "I hope to be able to do this again," unquote, in regard to running for president. Didn't sound like he was going to be running, by the way, leading up to this. This is a bit of a surprise. Indications were that he was going to take a pass this time. In an October 2015 blog post, Johnson wrote an open letter titled, "Why I Would Run for President." In it, he railed against both parties. This is part of why I support him, because that's what I do. I rail against both parties. And said that Rand Paul, despite some hopes among libertarians that he would campaign as a different kind of Republican, quote, has emerged with a vague mix of positions that is clearly not compelling. There is a price to be paid for selling out, and he is paying it, unquote. Johnson, I agree. Johnson resigned from his position as director and CEO of Cannabis Sativa, Inc., a marijuana marketing and packaging company, earlier this week, according to Reason. Cannabis Sativa's mission statement, which was penned by Johnson, says the company, quote, believes cannabis is destined to become the next gold rush, and we're prepared to shape its future in a legal environment. So I've already endorsed a candidate. I have endorsed Darrell W. Perry, who is running for the Libertarian nomination. Darrell W. Perry, of course, he's can be frequently heard, actually most nights now, on Free Talk Live, which we do carry on IPM Nation. That is 7 nights a week from 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern on IPM Nation 1. And they're a nationally syndicated show. They're heard all over. They're on, I think, 160 stations, including ours. And Darrell also hosts a show called Peace, Love, Liberty, which is weekdays at 4 p.m. Eastern on IPM Nation 1. So he's part of the IPM Nation family. And I've never met Darrell in person, actually. All of our dealings have been via Facebook, and he's been on the show. I've talked to him on the radio version of this show and whatnot, and I like Darrell very much. So there is some bias there. Now, do I think that, and I'm not withdrawing my endorsement of Darrell, I will continue to endorse him until he loses the Libertarian nomination to the inevitable Gary Johnson. Again, I'm into the predictions, so that's my prediction. I like Darrell very much. I will vote for him. Well, I won't vote for him because I won't have an opportunity to, because I can't vote in the Libertarian. They do a convention apparently once a year. You know, they don't have primaries like there's no Libertarian primary. It's not like the Democratic and Republican primary. So what I'll do is on primary day, I'll go in and vote in the Democratic primary for whoever I'm going to vote for. Maybe I'll write in Daryl, and then in the general election, I'll vote for Gary Johnson, because much as I like Daryl, Gary Johnson will be the Libertarian nominee. So I'll vote for him on election day. Trump will be the Republican nominee. Hillary Clinton will be the Democratic nominee and will be the next president. I find this election cycle, as much as on one hand, here's the problem with Trump being in. On one hand, it's very exciting and interesting because Trump is the most colorful, entertaining figure. I mean, I remember back in 92, the first election I was old enough to vote in, I thought Ross Perot, as many people did, thought was pretty entertaining and colorful and interesting. But Trump just has kind of enveloped everything. But unfortunately, he's also made things incredibly predictable. I mean, I can see how this is all going to play out. I'll be very surprised if I'm wrong about this. Although I would have been very surprised if I'd been wrong about Rick Perry. So, but that's my prediction. So, but I'm glad to see Gary Johnson is getting in. That's good. And even if nobody votes for him, hopefully he can drive some discussion. And I know some of you are probably thinking, particularly my more liberal-minded friends would probably think, well, why would you even support someone who has not only no chance of winning, but he's one of those crazy libertarian types, right? I know a lot of people think that libertarianism, a lot of liberals think that libertarianism is incompatible with liberalism. I thought that at one time. But the truth is, if you really look at it, if you go issue by issue, I say this all the time, libertarianism has just as much in common with liberalism as it does conservatism. Libertarians and conservatives tend to agree on fiscal issues, but budgetary issues and so forth, and in terms of what the federal government should or shouldn't be doing. But libertarians tend to agree with liberals on quite a few things, like cannabis, like the death penalty. Foreign policy, libertarians tend to be very almost isolationist, which is more closer to liberalism than it is to conservatism. And there's other examples, but, I think that you could argue libertarianism, again, because people who don't know much about it think of it as sort of this far-right extreme. And part of that, too, is because libertarians have kind of staked out a portion of the Republican Party. Libertarians tend to be Republicans, but not always. Here in New Hampshire, I mean, she's been in the news a lot. We have Amanda Bolden, who's a Democrat, who is very much a part of the liberty movement. And it's like I said to Jen one day, she was giving me a hard time about being a Democrat and being libertarian, and I said, well, I'm an Amanda Bolden Democrat. What do you want? And she seemed to like that explanation. I mean, that's, they have a lot in common. And libertarianism, I think, in a lot of ways occupies the middle. Because it's really hard to be, if you're a moderate anything, right or left, moderate, centrist type of individual, you have the two parties which have both, in terms of who represents us, have become so extreme. They've really kind of kicked out all the moderates. There really aren't a whole lot of conservative Democrats or moderate Republicans left. And if you, and on the Republican side, if you take any moderate positions, if you're not a far-right extremist on absolutely everything, they call you a rhino. Nationally, that happens. New Hampshire, where we are in New Hampshire, it's a little different. There's more dynamism in the Republican Party, and you do have these sort of different factions and whatnot. But nationally, if you see it all the time. Republicans who dare step out of line on anything get called a rhino, a Republican in name only. I've heard that said about Jeb Bush because he's for immigration reform. Oh, he's a rhino. He's a liberal, which is just silly. If you look at his positions on the whole, no, he's not. Of course not. He's a conservative Republican. He just happens to disagree with conservatives on this one thing. But if you disagree on one thing, you're labeled a rhino. So it's hard for moderates. It's hard for centrists. But libertarianism, I think, does occupy a big part of the middle. There are people who are both, maybe it's not the best example because there are pro-life libertarians, but I'll go with it. There are people who are both pro-choice and pro-marriage equality. That's another thing where liberals and libertarians agree. You should be able to marry whoever you want. There are people who who believe, who take what tend to be the liberal position on these issues. Death penalty certainly is another one. And yet they are also fiscal conservatives. So what do you do if you're a fiscal conservative, but you're liberal on social issues? Where do you go? I mean, most of the so-called Reagan Democrats, I think at this point are dead, and there were certainly also Republicans who voted for Bill Clinton because Clinton was no liberal, certainly not in his second term. Certainly not after the whole Newt Gingrich's contract with America and all that. So where do you go if you're a centrist, if you're a moderate, if you don't want to go either far right or far left? In other words, if you're not an extremist, or as I like to call myself, a non-ideological practical pragmatist, where do you go? You go libertarian. That's just, I didn't necessarily, and I consider myself sort of a quasi-libertarian, a small L libertarian. I'm not an official member of the Libertarian Party. I don't really want to be a member of any party. I'm not a joiner. I don't want to join a party. It has to do with my aversion to groupthink. But where it's just kind of where I end up. If you look at where I'm going to land on the political spectrum, I seem to agree with libertarians on most things. There's a major thing I disagree with libertarians on, which is part of why I can't go all in libertarian, and that's most libertarians I talk to think it would be a great idea for the United States to never again raise our debt ceiling and allow the country to, for the first time in our nation's history, go into default and actually default on the full faith and credit of the United States, which I think is absolutely insane. And I say this with great love and respect to my libertarian friends. You are insane for thinking that's a great idea. I'm not saying don't rein in spending. Of course we should rein in spending, but with the debt limit, you're pledging to pay on the debt that's already been incurred. And to default, any economist will tell you, virtually any economist, it's not just some left-wing Keynesian economics idea that we can't allow default. Conservative supply-side economists will tell you the same thing. Default is not an option. Reagan, everyone's big conservative hero, St. Reagan, used to say, we can never allow the United States to default. And yet, a lot of Republicans, and unfortunately most libertarians, as far as I know, this seems to be the position that we should default. And I think that's crazy. But anyway, I kind of got sidetracked. So here's, let's get into what's going on in Oregon a little bit. And I'm going to I have a lot that I want to cover today. So I'll try to keep this relatively short because I've talked about this quite a bit on the last two radio editions of the show. So I went into this really in depth Monday night. And again, you can find these right on IPMNation.com because we do archive them. But look, this will probably surprise some people, but I have arrived at the conclusion that I support these ranchers who have taken up the armed protest at this, I guess it's a welcome center in Oregon. Yes, I stand with them, figuratively, of course. I'm not going to go to Oregon and strap on a weapon. With the caveat, I support them with the caveat that no shots are fired, that this remain nonviolent, a nonviolent protest. And yes, I realize they're armed. I realize there is a danger there. Everyone remembers Waco, and there's other examples in history, in American history, where this kind of situation has gone bad. There's also examples where this kind of situation has turned out okay. One of the people whose name He's not actually directly involved because apparently he doesn't want to be, but his name gets mentioned because his two sons are involved. Cliven Bundy, you know, everyone remembers it was just in 2014, Cliven Bundy and his protest against the federal government over wanting to charge him for the, you know, the grazing fees. He didn't want to pay his taxes. You know, a lot of people kind of pilloried him as a glorified tax dodger, while people in right-wing media like Sean Hannity and Glenn Beck, they hoisted him up as this big hero, this anti-federal government hero. You know, and a lot of people made fun of him and whatnot. And, you know, how could you not? I mean, first of all, I mean, the guy's name, Cliven Bundy, he sounds like a character in a slasher film. You know, you've got Jason, you've got Freddy Krueger, and you've got Cliven Bundy, right? But you know, it just sounds like someone, you know, you'd want to be Cliven Bundy. That's a scary name. Maybe that's just my perception, but I personally don't want to ever meet someone named Cliven. That just sounds bad. But you know, and then of course it was kind of hilarious watching people like Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity trip over themselves to put some distance between their earlier worship of Cliven after he made some unfortunate, very politically incorrect sounding comments that really kind of just changed to the whole tone and tenor of the entire discussion. But here's why I support what these ranchers are doing. They are the genesis of this, which gets glossed over because, you know, with the mainstream sort of soundbite, short attention span media, they've given off, and that's not across the board. There's been some really in-depth reporting on this, but of course the short soundbite version that a lot of people see and hear and read it is that, you know, okay, so a bunch of these crazy militia anti-government types have taken over a federal building in Oregon, and they have guns, and there could be a shootout, and who knows what could happen. And it's just more crazy. It's domestic terrorism. It's, you know, it's their own version of. I'm trying to think of what the. I heard somebody refer to them derisively as they're not jihadists, they're y'all-hadists or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was sort of clever, but that's how they've been painted. And in learning about this, so first of all, what sparked all of this was the Hammonds, this father and son, who they were convicted, wrongly in my view, of arson and sentenced to prison. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole thing about their case. I did that in great detail on Monday night and even talked about it again a little bit last night. So I'm not going to rehash all of that. You can go back and listen to that if you want, or you can just read up on it. But based on what appear to be the facts of the case as I understand them, I don't think they committed arson, and I don't think they should have been convicted of arson. There may have been mistakes and misjudgments made, but I don't think they should have been charged and convicted of arson, in my view. And again, like I said, I'm not going to get into all that now, why I believe that, but I wasn't there. I wasn't there for the trial. I wasn't a juror. I wasn't sitting there. So maybe there's elements of this additional information that I don't know, that I don't understand. But based on the facts as I understand them, I don't believe that they committed arson, and I don't believe that they should have been convicted. Now, the really, even if you're fine with them going to prison for this is the part that drives me nuts, is this resentencing nonsense. And I didn't even know that was a thing until this story broke. Resentencing. I'd never heard that word before, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal scholar, so apparently, I've done some research, and apparently resentencing is very common. But usually when resentencing occurs, it's because, as I understand it, and again, I'm no expert in the legal system, but a So a plaintiff is convicted of something, and in the process of appealing the case, obviously the goal of appealing the case is to overturn the conviction, but a lesser goal oftentimes is, if you can't get the conviction overturned, maybe you can get the sentence reduced. If you can convince a judge that the original judge on the case handed down too hefty of a sentence and it's unfair. It's like the guy from Ross Ulbricht, the Silk Road guy with the website, sentenced to life in prison. He should have that appealed. I mean, first of all, I don't think he should have been convicted. Second of all, life in prison is, the judge said at the time of sentencing, I'm giving you a life sentence to discourage other people from doing what you did. He didn't kill anybody, he didn't rape anybody, but he's spending the rest of his life in prison for building a website that the government didn't approve of. It's absolutely heinous. So resentencing is usually done apparently that's the end game if you can't get a conviction overturned, but the sentence is too stiff. You can argue for a reduced sentence. Well, apparently that's not the only time resentencing happens. Resentencing also can explain when what happened to the Hammonds happens, which is where basically they were convicted of arson, they were sent to prison, they served their sentences, they got out, and then another circuit court judge says, wait a minute, I don't think their original sentences were long enough. So guess what? They have to go back. I had no idea that was a thing where someone can serve time, pay their debt to society, and again, I question the conviction, but they pay their debt to society, they do their time, they get out, and then a judge who had nothing to do with the original case gets to just show up and say, you know what? I don't think these guys served long enough. Let's put them back in prison. And then they had to go back to prison. One of these guys is a 73-year-old man. Okay, it's a father and son. The dad is 73. I think the son is 46. 73-year-old man. And some jerk in a black robe says, you know what? Nah, I think we're going to put you back in jail. We'll probably die in prison. It's obscene. And this is what sparked this armed occupation that's going on in Oregon. And these ranchers are very upset. Everyone should be very upset. And, this part of the story gets lost in the narrative. I know, because the larger narrative, the soundbite narrative in the media becomes, more crazy anti-government armed militia paramilitary wannabes have taken over a federal building. And what gets lost is the details. They have a right to be angry, and they have a right to protest, in my view. Now, to be fair, let's go back to the resentencing thing. Legally, the basis for why this other federal judge said, wait a minute, we got to send them back, is this. They were originally convicted of something that carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years. The judge at the time didn't feel, the judge in the original case did not feel that was an appropriate sentence and decided to ignore the mandatory minimum and sentence them to a lighter sentence. And that's how they got caught up in this. Regardless, it's just wrong. I hope they're able to successfully appeal this and these guys can get sprung right back out. It's wrong. I don't care if look, and obviously, I mean, I would have far less sympathy for the Hammonds if they were convicted of, actually harming someone, like if they had killed somebody, of course, or raped someone or committed some sort of theft or fraud or whatever. Yeah, I would have less sympathy for them, but still, regardless of what they did, this is wrong. They served their time, what they understood to be their sentence, and then on a technicality, they're getting sent back. It's just not right. And I abhor mandatory minimums. I think they're terrible. We've seen this in California over the years, with that 3 strikes law where, and I'm not sure if that's still in place or not. That might have been repealed. I'm not sure. I need to look into that. But, somebody goes to prison a couple of times for, 3 strikes. On the 3rd strike, you're in for life. You don't get back out, which people who want to present themselves, politicians who want to present themselves as tough on crime, think that's a great thing. Yeah, tough on crime. I'm no nonsense. 3rd strike, they're in there for life. And that leads to situations where maybe someone committed a couple of armed robberies on the first couple of occasions and ended up in prison, and then their 3rd strike is they get caught with a little bit of cannabis, which should be legal anyway, but they get caught, they get convicted of that, and now they're serving a life sentence because of it, because that was their 3rd strike. It's asinine. It's wrong. Mandatory minimums of any kind are wrong. Judges absolutely must have the discretion to ignore those, as the judge correctly did in the original case. Actually, well, I think based on what I've read about it, I think that the judge in the original case should have dismissed the charges, but that didn't happen. But he at least did the right thing and said, no, we're not going to lock these guys up for 5 years. It's wrong. So that's what sparked this initial outrage. And then, then there's all this worry. Well, this will probably end badly. This is an armed protest, and one of the Bundy brothers, not Eamon, the other brother, I guess, had actually at one point made a statement to the media where he said something about, I'm willing to die or I'm willing to fight if it comes to violence or whatever, for what's right and whatnot. So I played on the radio show last night some audio of Fox's Megyn Kelly talking on her show with Eamon Bundy, who has emerged as the leader of this whole thing. And again, Cliven isn't involved at all. Cliven apparently doesn't want to be involved. I think he probably had his fill. He probably felt like he got burned the last time he was, part of the public's consciousness. But so I played audio of the conversation between Eamon Bundy and Megyn Kelly on the radio show last night, and I didn't have a chance. I saw the clip right before I went on the air, so I didn't have a chance to listen to it ahead of time, which is good because then I can react spontaneously as I'm playing it. And initially, I was kind of talking over it because there were these long pauses where, Eamon Bundy didn't necessarily seem like he was ready for. As I commented, I said he was in over his head, like he wasn't ready for this kind of, he's clearly had no media training. And I thought Megyn Kelly was a little bit condescending toward him, and it clearly threw him a little bit. And I made a comment. I was kind of picking on him. But then once he got rolling and got comfortable, I found myself increasingly sympathetic to the guy and his cause. To the point where by the end of the clip, I was like, I actually kind of like this guy. First of all, he brought up something. He said that the plaintiff in the case against the Hammonds is who? It's the federal government. So they're the plaintiff. They're the ones in charge of enforcing the rules. They make the rules. They enforce the rules in terms of, what goes on federal land, because apparently in the original case with the Hammonds, some federal land was burned, and it sounds like it was an accident, but again, we'll put the details of that aside. But so the federal government, they're the ones in charge. They make the rules. They decide how those rules are enforced. They decide what the penalties are. They're the ones who arrest you and put you on trial. And they're ultimately in control of everything. It's the federal government who says after you get out, oh, you got to go back in. It's all the federal government. So the federal government ultimately, in other words, the federal government is both the plaintiff and the judge. The game is rigged. There's no, as he said during that clip, there's no redress because the federal government's in complete control. They are both the plaintiff and the judge in this situation. So what chance do you have? And Eamon Bundy was saying correctly, that's wrong. That is wrong. These guys got screwed and there's nothing they can do about it. I mean, yeah, they can appeal the case, but unless there's more outrage across the country, which I hope that there is, but unfortunately, like I said, these guys have already been cast in the media as just more crazy militant people. Ultimately, they're just screwed. They're screwed by the system. It's rigged against them, and there is no redress. And he said that, and I thought, that's a really good point. And to be honest with you, I had never even really quite thought of it that way until he said it. And he said it very articulately. And that was when I first started to think, I kind of like this guy. And then he went on to say, because Megyn Kelly questioned him about the statement that his brother had made about, I'm willing to die, or, I'm willing to fight and die or whatever. And Eamon Bundy said that he disagreed with his brother's original statement, that he had already talked to him about it, and that their position, that is not their position, and that this will not come to violence. Eamon Bundy said, look, I'm a family man. I have a wife. I have children. I have a business. I didn't come here to die. I came here to protest. It's an armed protest, but we are here to protest what happened to the Hammonds because it's wrong. And he came across kind of a soft-spoken guy. He seems like a good dude. I mean, just watching him, I thought, he's right. I can't argue with anything he said. And, we can question the tactics because there is the risk of this going bad, but he has said, no, this will not end violently. I will not permit that. That is not the goal. I didn't come here to die. I came here to stand up for our rights, and that's what we're here to do. And this will be peaceful. And I thought, good for him. So my position as of now is I support the protest that these ranchers have undertaken. I think they're right. And, I hope that more people come around to understanding, look past, you got a bunch of guys in cowboy hats with guns in a federal building, try to look past that a little bit and say, well, why are they so upset? Because it's too easy to just kind of write it off as a bunch of, domestic terrorists. Then I saw this yesterday. Christian Farias, who is the legal affairs reporter for HuffPost, put something on HuffPost about this. It kind of digs into this, and I'll read this to you. It's very short because I want to comment on this and where I think the dialogue has gone awry, because he gets half of it right and half of it wrong, in my view. So this is what he wrote. And the title is, No, the Oregon Ranchers' prison sentences are not cruel and unusual, but there's still reason to sympathize with their militant defenders. Okay, so here's the article. The uproar over a militant occupation of a federal outpost in Oregon began with a rather mundane dispute over the criminal prosecutions of Dwight and Stephen Hammond, a father and son who waged a Byzantine fight with the federal government and lost. Neither man even took part in the anti-government protests that began over the weekend, yet the length of their prison sentences is somehow the center of it. A closer look at the Hammonds' legal spat reveals there really isn't much to it. Although there's a larger debate over the wisdom of any and all mandatory sentences, the 5-year term that each man was ordered to serve is perfectly legal. Okay, so let me stop there for a moment. So this is the part that he gets wrong. He glosses over what happened. They served their time, or what they thought was their time, and they were done. I think one of them was still under some sort of probationary supervision. But in terms of being locked up, they were done, or they thought they were done. They had every reason to believe they were done. So, he's making it sound like, they're just being forced to serve out their full sentences. That's all. And that's not what happened here. They were resentenced after They had already served their time, and that's wrong. Let me continue. The two ranchers reported to federal prison on Monday, and no haphazard insurgency will get them out. Well, that's probably true, but that doesn't mean you don't do something. That doesn't mean you don't protest in some way. Federal and local authorities are responding in kind. They don't seem very impressed by the occupation so far, which isn't to say that there isn't something legitimate about the occupiers' grievances. And this is the part he gets right. Which isn't to say there isn't something legitimate about the occupiers' grievances as they speak to the broader ills of the American system of punishment. Armed protesters took over the National Wildlife Refuge on Saturday after a peaceful rally over the prison sentences of local ranchers Dwight and Stephen Hammond. The Hammonds' troubles began in June 2012 when a jury convicted them of maliciously setting fire to a large swath of federal land in 2001 and 2006, a federal crime carrying a mandatory minimum penalty of 5 years in prison. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, which reviewed the Hammond sentences in 2014, explained that the jurors relied in part on testimony that during the 2001 fire, Stephen Hammond told a teenaged relative to drop lit matches on the ground so as to light the whole country on fire. The blaze consumed 139 acres of public land and apparently endangered the teen. That, by the way, definitely conflicts with other things that I've read about this. But the case would have been over had the trial court imposed the 5 years of imprisonment with that the law mandates. Instead, the judge cited the Eighth Amendment, which bars cruel and unusual punishment, and second-guessed Congress, which seems like a good instinct to me, concluding that the mandatory sentence was grossly disproportionate to the offense. He proceeded to sentence Dwight Hammond to 3 months and his son to 1 year and 1 day in prison. Now, I suspect that the reason he gave them what sounds like pretty light sentences, I mean, one of them only got 3 months in prison, was because they weren't intentionally trying to burn federal land. And again, I go into this in great deal on Monday's podcast if you want to go back and listen. There's a lot of details that aren't in here, but federal prosecutors appealed, arguing what they often argue when mandatory minimum sentences are at stake, that the law is the law and that judges have no discretion to deviate from it. Well, then why is the judge even involved in the ruling, right? Why don't you just let the jury decide they're guilty and then, the judge doesn't even have to sentence them. They just automatically get locked into a cell for 5 years. I mean, I'm not really arguing that it should be done that way, but, if context doesn't matter and there is no need for there to be an adult in the room to make these decisions, then really, can't you just streamline it and not even have a judge there? The Ninth Circuit agreed and essentially ruled the Hammond's lesser sentences to be illegal. BS! The original judge was right. Their original sentences would have been unconstitutional and would have violated the Eighth Amendment. Quote, given the seriousness of arson, a 5-year sentence is not grossly disproportionate to the offense, the appeals court said, before offering a lengthy list of far tougher sentences that the Supreme Court has upheld for arguably less serious crimes, like stealing golf clubs and possessing small amounts of marijuana. Oh, great. That's how they're justifying this. Because there's people who possessed small amounts of cannabis who are in there for longer sentences. So that makes it all okay. That's why they're so mad. That's why these ranchers are so mad. And they're right. They are right. Eamon Bundy, a leader of the anti-government militants that took over the Wildlife Refuge Center, staged the occupation in support of the Hammonds. The Hammonds, in turn, looked to the Supreme Court. In March of last year, the High Court declined to hear their appeal. By then, the men had already served their shorter sentences and were under supervised release. Without any recourse left, because as Eamon Bundy pointed out, there is no redress for this. The federal government's in charge. They're in charge at every step of the way. They're the plaintiff, and they are the judge. Without any recourse left, the two ranchers had to accept their fate. 5 years behind bars, minus any time they had already served. Or, as the Ninth Circuit wrote when it threw out the original punishment, they had to be resentenced in compliance with the law. That happened in October, and the Hammonds surrendered themselves on Monday as they were directed, bringing their personal battle with the federal government to an end. Again, this is a part where he gets it right. It is not wholly irrational, in view of all the tussling, to sympathize with the Hammonds and maybe even with their supporters, some of whom view the sentencing controversy as symptomatic of government overreach. Yeah, it is. More than symptomatic. I mean, it's a blatant example. But in the grand scheme of efforts to reform mandatory minimums, their case is only one of thousands, and many end up with longer sentences. The Hammonds case is fairly run-of-the-mill, said Ohio State law professor Douglas Berman, a sentencing expert. Quote, "The ugliness you identify here is an ugliness in the way our federal justice system operates," unquote. The ugliness, what Berman means is that federal prosecutors often seize on language in a statute, here, malicious destruction by fire of property belonging to the United States, and apply it to seemingly petty examples of such conduct. Later, they seek the stiffest punishment allowed, no matter how unfair the end result. And if the law calls for a mandatory minimum, the work is pretty much done for them. Berman said, quote, "I do think Congress did not have in mind the Hammonds for these mandatory minimums. And prosecutors can always convince themselves that a particular misdeed is really serious and therefore a harsh penalty is what legislators intended all along." And again, that's why the judge should have the discretion. The judge said the original sentences were unconstitutional. Well, who better to make that judgment than a freaking judge? Here's where the broader debate over mandatory minimum sentences goes, and why any fury over what has happened to the Hammonds and others like them should be aimed at Congress, which writes the laws that tie judges' hands and forbid them from showing leniency. Quote, "The Hammonds joined countless other individuals who were denied the opportunity for a judge to exercise appropriate judgment in imposing a rational sentence," unquote, said Congressman Bobby Scott, Democrat of Virginia, a staunch opponent to mandatory minimums, in a sentence on Tuesday. Scott has sponsored or co-sponsored a number of bills aimed at curtailing the practice. If decades of unduly punitive sentencing policies have shown us anything, it is that thousands of people like the Hammonds, ordinary Americans who may have broken the law but are far from hardened criminals, bear the brunt of Congress's folly. Berman said, quote, "They're comparable to a heck of a lot of people, especially black and brown people, stuck with mandatory minimums," unquote. Absolutely correct. That's why we have these ridiculous drug laws where we lock up. I mean, our prisons are overflowing with minority defendants convicted for having some marijuana. And it's in many cases, I mean, we've all heard the stories. People serving sentences longer for petty drug offenses than someone who raped or murdered somebody. You know, it's amazing. And it's awful. And the reason it happens is it's careerism on the part of these congressmen who want to appear tough on crime. So they go for things like mandatory sentences, regardless of how unfair and, frankly, unconstitutional it is. It is unconstitutional. It does violate the Eighth Amendment because it leads to cruel and unusual punishment. Of course, so does the death penalty. The death penalty clearly violates the Eighth Amendment as well. We're already almost out of time. I really got hung up on that, but I wanted to really kind of make everybody understand, because I'm sure I surprised some people coming out on this issue the way I did. But I will say again, yes, I support the armed protest going on at that federal building in Oregon right now. I do not support the use of violence in any circumstance like this, and I hope it doesn't come to that, and I don't believe it will. I take Ammon Bundy at his word. I like him. He seems like a sincere guy, and I don't think he's interested in any sort of armed conflict, but they are armed, as they have a right to be, and they have a right to protest. And we'll see where this goes. I hope that something good comes out of it. since we're about out of time, I'll have to spend more time. Well, I spent some time on this last night on the radio show too, but Obama continues to just confound and puzzle me on the issue of immigration. On the one hand, he's tried to do some positive things via executive action in terms of, stemming the tide of deportations, but he's like a Jekyll and Hyde on this stuff. It's very, very strange. He has tried to do some positive things in this area because Congress won't act on immigration reform. They can't, they never will, because the Republican Party has completely boxed themselves in on this issue. If you support any kind of immigration reform, you're automatically labeled as being for amnesty and being a rhino and being in favor of illegal immigration. It's amazing. So there is no solution as far as the Republicans are concerned, other than building a wall and kicking everybody out, which is silly and stupid. But so Obama, because he can't get Congress to do anything, has tried to do some things in terms of executive action, which have been challenged via the Supreme Court. But then on the other hand, this same president who, and this is something that, if you just listen to conservative talk radio or watch Fox News, you might not be aware of this, but this president has been actually very tough with deportations and very proactive with deportations, which I don't agree with. I don't agree with the tactics here, but the same president, pro-immigration activists refer to him derisively as the deporter-in-chief. The Obama administration has deported more people than any other president in history. And it's obscene. And now there's this, look, they're rounding up, they're rounding people up, and anyone who knows anything about history should be creeped out at the idea of rounding people up, but that's what they're doing. And they're splitting up families. They're deporting entire families. There's a new push with this right now. This is going on right now in America under the auspices of the Obama administration. And they say, hey, we're enforcing the law. It's just strange to me. I don't like it. Michael Savage, forgive me if I'm repeating myself. I know I've brought this up at least one other time, but Michael Savage, conservative talk show host, about as right-wing as you can get, and even dabbles a little bit in conspiracy theory. But Michael Savage, of all people, has said on his show, because I listen occasionally in the Jeep, has said that he doesn't agree with the government coming in and just, splitting up families and deporting families and whatnot. He doesn't even agree with that. He says we should be taking out the trash, as he puts it. In other words, certainly deporting criminals, deporting people who come here, they break the law to come here, first of all, but then once they're here, they continue to violate the law in other ways. The troublemakers, yes, those people we should send back, get them out of here. But make that the priority, not splitting up families and taking people who've been here for years and have conducted themselves within accordance of the law, aside from being in the country illegally. But other than that, have conducted themselves within the law. Those should not be the targets of these deportations. It's not practical and it's not ethical. And I agree with him. It's not often that I agree with Michael Savage on much. Michael Savage, by the way, for those who may not be familiar with him, not only is he one of the most successful conservative talk show hosts in history, but he is entertaining. He's very entertaining to listen to, even though I disagree with him on so many things. I think part of it's a put on because he kind of does what Glenn Beck does, in that he's a conservative who does dabble a little bit in conspiracy theory, but he also in 2002, before MSNBC was the liberal counterpart to the conservative Fox News, when they had more of a mixture of different kinds of shows, Michael Savage was actually on MSNBC. He was on there for 3 months, and he would take calls. He would take calls live on the air, just like on his radio show. Political television shows used to do that then. Now none of them do it, but back then they did. And he got into an argument with one particular caller and ended up wishing that the caller would get AIDS. And that was, I believe, the final episode of The Savage Nation on MSNBC. They fired him after that. He only lasted 3 months, but he just couldn't help himself. He wished that someone get AIDS, and you're not really supposed to do that. I personally, I don't think I've ever done that on this program. I don't think I've ever wished AIDS on anyone. So can't imagine I would do that either. But anyway, so we're out of time. Thank you all for watching the first Matt Connarton Unleashed television edition of 2016. Happy New Year, everybody. Don't forget the radio edition of the show 5 nights a week on IPM Nation Live 1. And don't forget, too, if you're watching live on Wednesday, we have a big show later on Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades. Senator Bob Smith will be with Gary and I, as well as Heidi Cruz, Ted Cruz's wife, who apparently is running the ground game here in New Hampshire, leading up to the New Hampshire primary, and Bill O'Brien will be with us as well. So that'll be a big show. So anyway, that's it for me for now. I'll talk at you all a little bit later. Thanks, everybody.